The snow came early that year. It did not arrive the way snow sometimes does. Gently apologetically, as though asking permission to settle on the world. It arrived like a verdict. It arrived the way certain truths arrive, without warning, without softness, without any concern for whether you were ready. By the time the first flakes had thickened into a curtain of white, the road into Harrow's Crossing had already swallowed itself. The pines along the ridge bent under the weight of it. The creek at the valley's edge went silent. Not frozen, not yet, but hushed, the way water gets when it senses it is about to be changed into something it does not recognize. And in the last cabin at the far end of the settlement, a woman stood at a window and watched all of it come. Her name was Marin. She was 31 years old, and she had the kind of face that looked older when she was still and younger when she moved. She was not beautiful in the way that draws attention. She was beautiful in the way that outlasts attention, the way a stone worn smooth by a river becomes something worth holding, not because it dazzles, but because it fits so perfectly in your hand that setting it down feels wrong. She stood at the window for a long time, not because she was afraid of the snow. She had survived worse than snow. She stood at the window because standing at windows was one of the few things she allowed herself that served no practical purpose. It was the one small indulgence she had not yet convinced herself to give up. Everything else in her life had been stripped to necessity. The cabin itself was proof of that. Spare, clean, functional. 2 chairs, one larger than the other, though she lived alone and had lived alone for 3 years now. A table, a stove, a shelf of dried goods organized with a precision that spoke less of tidiness and more of a person who needed to know exactly what she had and exactly what she did not. She could not afford surprises. She could not afford the luxury of not knowing. The extra chair she had never moved. It sat across the table from her own, as it always had, empty, slightly angled, as though someone had just stood up from it and would return. She did not sit in it. She did not remove it. She simply let it be what it was. A fact she had not yet decided what to do with. Outside, the snow came on. The nearest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile away, which in summer felt like a manageable distance and in winter felt like the edge of the known world. The settlement of Harrow's Crossing was not a cruel place. Not exactly. It was merely the kind of place where people's silences had weight, where what was not said gathered in corners and doorways like old smoke, where a woman living alone in the last cabin at the edge of the tree line was not gossiped about openly. She was simply not spoken of at all, which is its own particular kind of cold. She had arrived 3 years ago in the back of a freight wagon, with a small valise, 2 tins of seed, and no explanation that anyone could extract from her. The man who had driven the wagon, a taciturn fellow named Briggs, who moved freight between settlements and asked no questions as a matter of professional principle, had set her down at the edge of the road, collected his coin, and moved on without looking back. She had watched him go. She had stood in the road for a moment with her valise at her feet and her seeds in her hands, and she had looked at the settlement, the handful of structures, the general store, the livery, the narrow strip of road that served as the town's only artery. And she had made a decision so quietly and so completely that no one watching would have known a decision had been made at all. She would stay. She would ask nothing. She would give them no reason to speak about her. And she would not, under any circumstances, expect anything from anyone. It was not bitterness that had brought her to this. Bitterness is hot, and she was not hot. She was the temperature of a room that has not been heated in some time, not freezing, not hostile, simply cool to whatever the world around it happened to be. She had been left before. She had been left in ways that accumulated, that built on one another like stones in a wall, until the wall became something she lived inside rather than something she had constructed. Her father first, when she was 8, not dead, just gone, which is worse. A husband at 24, who had lasted 4 years, and then discovered that his courage was smaller than his ambitions, and had followed his ambitions east. 2 other women who had been, briefly, something close to friends, and who had found better options and taken them without a great deal of ceremony. She did not blame any of them. That was the part that would have surprised people if they had known. She bore no particular anger toward the ones who had left. She had simply learned, the way you learn the weight of a tool after using it long enough, that departure was the nature of people. You held them lightly. You did not let your hands close around them. You kept your dependencies small and your expectations smaller, and your expectations smaller, and you got on with the work of surviving. So she had built the cabin herself, with lumber she had traded for and the help of Briggs on one final run, who had stacked wood for her without being asked because he was that kind of man, and then left without being thanked because she did not realize until he was already gone that she should have. She had planted her seeds in spring. She had grown what she could and traded the surplus for the rest. She had built her stores with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that no one is coming to bring you anything, so you had better bring it to yourself. 3 years. 3 winters, and now the 4th was arriving at the window, thick and white and indifferent, and she watched it the way she watched everything, steadily, without drama, already calculating what it would cost her, and whether she had enough. She turned from the window. She went to the stove, and checked the wood box, and found it lower than she liked. She put on her coat. The wood was stacked against the eastern wall of the cabin, sheltered by a narrow overhang. She had added the 2nd winter when she realized the 1st winter's arrangement was inefficient. The snow was already an inch deep and falling still. She moved through it without hurrying. There was a way she had of moving through difficult conditions that was neither graceful nor ungainly. It was simply direct. She went from where she was to where she needed to be, by the most efficient path, and she did not waste motion on complaint or hesitation. She loaded the wood into her arms. She was nearly back to the door when she saw the horse. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 40 yards distant, still as a carving, its breath coming in slow plumes in the cold air. A bay, deep red-brown, with no markings she could see from this distance. It wore a saddle. The saddle was occupied. The man on the horse was watching the cabin. She stopped. She held her firewood, and she looked at him, and he looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched itself thin. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the trees. She stood where she was for a breath longer. The snow falling around her. The snow falling around her, the wood smoke from her own chimney curling overhead. Then she went inside and stacked the wood and latched the door, and did not think about it again. Or rather, she thought about it in the way she thought about it, in the way she thought about most things that could not be immediately addressed. She set it aside in a part of herself that was organized and waiting, like a shelf, and she got on with the evening. She did not see him again for 4 days. The storm lasted 2 of those days, and then broke, leaving the world white and exhausted and clean. She dug herself out on the morning of the 3rd day, cleared the path from the cabin to the woodpile, assessed her stores, and found them adequate. Not comfortable, adequate. There was a difference she knew well. On the 4th day she went to the general store for salt, and found the town in a low simmer of attention, directed somewhere she could not immediately identify. There were 3 women standing near the counter who stopped talking when she entered, which was not unusual, except that this time they had been talking about something that had been talking about something that had made them animated, and the absence of that animation after her arrival was more conspicuous than usual. She bought her salt. The storekeeper, a man named Howell, who was not unkind but who was deeply susceptible to the opinions of his neighbors, counted her change twice and would not quite meet her eyes. She asked him nothing. She took her salt and went outside, and there across the road, leaning against the post of the livery with his arms folded and his hat brim low, was the man from the tree line. She could see him clearly now. He was tall, not unusually so, but the kind of tall that is proportioned, that carries itself without apology. Somewhere in his middle 30s, his coat was plain and dark and practical. His face was the kind of face that does not announce itself, not handsome in a way that demands notice, but arranged in such a way that once you looked, it was difficult to find a reason to stop. There was stillness in it, not blankness, something more considered than blankness, a stillness that had been chosen. He was looking at her, not in the way men sometimes looked at her, with the particular combination of assessment and entitlement that she had learned to recognize and dismiss. He was looking at her the way you look at something you are trying to understand the weight of, careful, unhurried. She looked back at him for exactly as long as she would have looked at anything else of uncertain significance, and then she walked home. His name, she learned, not from him, and not by asking, but through the inevitable osmosis of small settlements, was Callum. He had come from somewhere west, the name of which was unclear, and possibly different, depending on who told the story. He had taken the old Fenwick place at the north edge of the settlement, a property that had sat empty for 2 seasons after old Fenwick had gone to live with his daughter's family in the valley. It was in poor repair. The fences were down, the outbuildings sagging, the fields choked with the particular determined weed that always moved in when cultivation stopped. He had arrived with his horse, a pack mule, and 2 crates of tools. He had spoken to no one extensively. He had paid Howell for what he needed. He had nodded at people in the road. He had, by all available evidence, simply begun working. This, at least, was something she understood. She began to notice things. This was not intentional. She was not a woman who watched people closely as a habit. She had learned that watching people closely led to the development of expectations, and expectations were an expense she could not justify. But the settlement was small and her errands were regular, and noticing, it turned out, required no effort when the thing being noticed was in the way. He was, she observed, the kind of man who finished things when he set out to repair the Fenwick fence line, and she could see the northern edge of it from the road she took to the creek. He did it section by section, systematically, with no visible impatience. He did not hurry where hurrying would have produced shoddy work, and he did not slow where slowing served no purpose. He moved through his labor the way she moved through hers, directly, without waste. She noticed that he did not drink, or at least did not drink in the way that shows. She noticed that he had no particular affiliation with any of the groups that constituted the settlement's social architecture. The men who gathered outside the livery in the late afternoon, the families who organized themselves around the small church at the settlement center. He attended neither. He was not hostile to either. He simply existed at a slight angle to the settlement's social gravity, as though the usual forces had slightly less pull on him than on other people. She noticed one afternoon in early winter, when she was crossing the common ground near the store, that he had stopped to help old Marsden get his wagon out of the mud without being asked him, without making a production of it. He had simply appeared, put his shoulder to it, moved on. Marsden had called after him, and he had raised one hand, not turning back, which was either rudeness or efficiency, and she had decided, for reasons she could not fully articulate, that it was the latter. She noticed that he had seen her noticing him, and that he had not reacted to it in any way that put a demand on her. This was unusual enough to register. It was Howell's wife, a woman named Dora, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and whose tongue moved faster than was always kind, who first made the shape of the thing explicit in Marin's presence. It was the week before the deep cold, and Marin was at the store for flour, and Dora was there with her sister, and the 3 of them occupied the space, in the particular awkward geometry of people who have never found a comfortable angle with each other. "That man Callum's been clearing the south field," Dora said. "Not precisely to Marin, and not precisely not to her. Backs right up against your property line, doesn't it?" "It does," Marin said. "Because it did." "Convenient," Dora said, and left the word there, soft and multidirectional as a thrown stone. Marin took her flour. She did not dignify it with confusion, because she was not confused. She understood exactly what Dora meant. She understood the sentence beneath the sentence, the implication that proximity was conspiracy, that 2 solitary people existing near each other must be existing near each other for reasons that the community had a right to know about and judge. She walked home. She thought as she walked that she was tired. Not physically. Physically she was fine. Her body was reliable. She had taken good care of it because it was the only tool she had that she truly could not replace. She was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that accumulates from years of managing the gap between who you are and who the world has decided you are. The kind of tired that comes from spending so much energy on not expecting, not hoping, not reaching, that there is very little left over for anything else. She had not asked him to clear his field adjacent to hers. She had not asked him to do anything. She had not asked anyone for anything in 3 years, and she was not planning to start. The thing that changed, or rather, the first thing that changed in the sequence of things that would eventually change everything, was the matter of the Alderton boy. She did not know the Alderton boy. She did not know the Alderton family well. They were 3 families down the valley, part of a cluster of related households that had come west together and maintained the tight, somewhat impermeable social unit that such migrations often produce. The boy, whose name was Padir, and who was perhaps 13, had a habit of taking shortcuts across properties that were not his, which in itself was not remarkable. Boys do this everywhere. What was remarkable was that he had, on some occasion she had not witnessed, knocked over a portion of her eastern fence during one of these transits and had not mentioned it to anyone, and so the fence had sat broken for several weeks while she was unaware of it, and 3 of her hens had gone missing in what she had attributed to a predator, but now suspected might be attributed to a gap in a fence that should not have been a gap. She discovered the fence on a Tuesday morning when she was doing her regular survey of the property perimeter. She did this every week because the property was hers in the way that very few things had ever been hers, entirely and legally and without condition, and she maintained it with corresponding care. She stood at the broken section and looked at it. The break was fresh, the wood splintered in a way that spoke of impact rather than weather or age. On the other side of the break in the softened mud, there were boot prints, small boot prints, the size of a 13-year-old boy. She considered her options. Going to the Alderton family was possible, but likely to produce the particular unpleasantness that arises when you accuse someone's child of damage they have not admitted to. The Aldertons were well connected in the settlement. She was not. The calculation was not complicated. She was still standing at the broken fence, working through this calculation, when she became aware that she was not alone. She did not startle. She turned. Callum was standing approximately 10 feet away, on his own side of the property line. He had a length of fence rail in his hands. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. "May I?" he said. It was not quite a question. It had the shape of a question, but the weight of something that had already decided to wait for as long as it needed to wait. She looked at him for a moment. "You have your own fence to see to," she said. "Mine is finished," he said. She looked at the broken section. She looked at the rail in his hands, which was the correct length for the repair, which meant he had measured it before coming, which meant he had measured it before this morning, which meant he had been paying attention. Something moved in her chest. Small, brief. She did not look at it directly. "I can repair my own fence," she said. "I know," he said. He did not move. He did not press. He stood with the rail in his hands and waited with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be and no investment in any particular outcome. She stood with her own thoughts for a moment longer. Then she stepped back from the fence. He came forward. He set the rail and worked with quiet efficiency. And she stood and watched him work. And neither of them said anything for the duration of it. And when he was done, he tested the repair with both hands, nodded at it once, and walked back to his own property. He did not look at her as he left. He did not wait for thanks. She stood at the repaired fence for a while after he was gone, her hands in her coat pockets, the cold air moving slowly through the pines. There was something she could not put a name to happening in the back of her chest. She recognized it the way you recognize a word in a language you once spoke and have mostly forgotten. The shape of it familiar, the meaning just outside reach. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at her table and did not look at the empty chair. Winter settled fully. The settlement of Harrow's Crossing contracted in the way that all small communities contract in cold weather. The social perimeter drew in. The daily movements shortened. The gossip thickened and sharpened from lack of other entertainment. It was in this thickened atmosphere that a particular story began to circulate, as such stories do, finding its shape through repetition and embellishment until it bore only passing resemblance to whatever had originally generated it. The story, in its final circulating form, concerned Marin. The specifics shifted depending on who was telling it and to whom, but the architecture was consistent. She had, in some previous life before Harrow's Crossing, done something that warranted the departure of her husband. What exactly she had done was unclear and variable. The story was less interested in the truth of it than in the fact of her having been left, which, in the community's moral calculus, constituted evidence of some fundamental deficit in her. You were not abandoned without reason. You were not left without deserving it. This was the settlement's theology on the subject, unexamined and deeply held. She became aware of the story on a Wednesday, when she went to the store and found a group of women who went quiet with a particular quality of guilt that was distinct from their usual quality of indifference. She bought what she needed. She left. She walked home with her purchases, and her dignity arranged around her like a coat, and if the coat required more effort than usual to keep in place, that effort was not visible. She had heard the story before, versions of it, in other places at other times. The story was not about her specifically, it never was. It was about what women like her represented, a proof of concept that departure was justified, that some people were fundamentally leavable, that the community was correct to maintain its distance. She had survived every previous iteration of the story. She would survive this one. She set her jaw, and she set her stores, and she set about the work of not needing anyone, which was the work she had been doing for 23 years, and which she was, by now, very good at. What she did not anticipate was Callum, not his response to the story. She did not yet know that he had heard it. What she did not anticipate was the small and unpredicted way in which his continued unremarkable presence began to complicate her understanding of what she was surviving. He did not stop coming by the property line. Not frequently, this was not a man who made a habit of imposition, but regularly and always with some practical purpose that preceded any social one. He had noticed, she realized over the course of several weeks, that her supply of cured wood was running lower than the winter's demands would require. He had, without announcement or permission, begun adding to the stack, not doing it in her presence, not leaving any indication of authorship, simply adding to it. She knew it was him because she had seen no one else in the area, and because the wood was cured in the same manner as the wood she had seen stacked at the Fenwick property. She could have told him to stop. She stood at the wood pile on a morning of brilliant cold, the sky bleached white above the pines, and thought about telling him to stop, and could not manufacture a reason that held together. He was adding to her wood supply. Objecting to this was the kind of thing you did when you needed to prove something, and she was too tired this particular morning to spend energy on proof. She let it continue. What she had not yet fully understood was that this was Callum's particular quality. Not heroism, not courtship, not any of the performances that men sometimes produced around women they wanted something from. His quality was simpler and rarer than any of those. It was constancy. It was the quality of water that, finding a rock in its path, does not attempt to remove the rock or go dramatically around it, but simply continues to move in whatever direction is available, persistent and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the drama of its own persistence. She had never encountered it before, in quite this form. She did not know what to do with it, and so she did what she had learned to do with things she didn't know what to do with. She put it on the shelf and got on with the work. The accusation came in January. She had been in the store. It was a difficult morning already. The cold had gotten into her left knee in the night, and the walk into the settlement had been longer in pain than in distance, and she was tired, and she was low on patience, and all of this should perhaps be understood as context for what happened next, though in truth it would not have mattered if she had been well rested and entirely patient, because the accusation would have landed the same way regardless. It was Alderton himself, the father, not the boy, who made it. He was a large man whose size contributed to a confidence that had never been adequately tested, and so had grown past its actual basis. He made the accusation in the middle of the store in front of Howell and two other men, in a loud voice whose volume was a kind of violence, that Marin had stolen his grain. She had not. The evidence, as she would later understand, she had not. The evidence, as she would later understand, was circumstantial to the point of meaninglessness. Some grain had gone missing from his storage, in a manner he had not been able to explain, and the missing grain coincidentally occurred during a period when Marin had been trading her surplus in the settlement, and the association between these two facts had been sufficient for Alderton's particular kind of logic to close the distance. She stood in the middle of the store, and she heard the accusation, and she felt the weight of the room shift, the subtle realignment of everyone present, the way Howell's face went careful and closed, the way the two other men became very interested in the middle distance. She was not afraid. She was not even precisely angry. She was something colder and more specific than anger. She was confirmed. This was what she had always known. This was the thing she had organized her life around, that eventually, inevitably, the world would find its reason to discard you, and the kindest thing you could do for yourself was to have already made yourself small enough and independent enough that the discarding did not take anything you couldn't afford to lose. She said, clearly and without raising her voice, "I took nothing that wasn't mine. Alderton's face did what faces do when they have committed to a position and been directly contradicted. It reddened and hardened and found a new gear. He said more things. He said them loudly. She stood and took it, not because she had no response, but because she was calculating. She was always calculating. And the calculation here was that Alderton had weight in this settlement that she did not, and the men in this room would believe him before they believed her. And fighting this fight in this room on this morning was a fight she could not win, and losing fights you cannot win is how you end up with nothing left. She put her purchases under her arm, and she walked to the door. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked home in the cold with her bad knee and her good spine, and she sat at her table, and she was very still for a very long time. She did not see Callum that day. She did not see him the day after. On the third day she began to understand, with the particular clarity of a person whose worst expectations are confirming themselves, that this was how it went. The accusation was the kind of thing that attached itself to a person, and the people around that person performed their own calculations. And sometimes the calculation produced loyalty, and sometimes it produced distance. And she had never, not once in her adult life, been on the fortunate side of that calculation. She began to plan, not dramatically. This was not a woman who did things dramatically. She began to plan in the quiet, practical way that she planned everything, assessing her stores, assessing her property, considering what could be transported and what would have to be surrendered, thinking about what came next in the sequence of moving on that she knew by now almost as well as she knew her own name. It had happened before. It would happen again. She packed nothing. She made no decisions. She simply held the shape of departure in the back of her mind as she went through her days. As she did her work, as she maintained the routines that were the architecture of her survival, the shape of departure was familiar. It had a weight to it, the way a tool has weight, not pleasant, but known. On the 5th day after the accusation, she was at the creek breaking ice to draw water, when she heard him. She did not hear him before she saw him, which meant he was not making noise, which meant, because he was not the kind of man who moved carelessly, that he had come to the creek from the same direction. She usually came from the creek, along the path that ran behind the eastern property line. He was carrying a bucket. He looked at her ice and her bucket, and her posture, which she knew was the posture of someone holding something in. He said nothing. He broke ice alongside her. She watched him work for a moment. Then she said, not looking at him, "You've heard what Alderton said." "Yes," he said. And she said. And she said. It was not a question in the usual sense. It was a demand for the next thing. The thing that always followed. The announcement of recalibration, of distance. She wanted it said out loud. She wanted it over. He filled his bucket. He stood. He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at her, without performance, without pressure, with a kind of flat, unhurried attention that she had never quite encountered in anyone else. And nothing, he said. She looked at him. "I have my water," he said. "I'll see you tomorrow." He picked up his bucket and walked back along the path, the way he had come, and the sound of his footsteps diminished and disappeared into the cold air, and she stood at the creek for a long time after he was gone. The ice moved under the current below. The pines were very still. She did not move until her hands were cold. What he had said occupied her for the rest of the day. And nothing. She turned it over the way you turn over a stone. You are not sure what to do with, examining it from different angles, testing its weight. She had expected something. Even something kind would have been something, an expression of doubt about Alderton's reliability, an awkward assertion of her innocence, some form of managed distance that allowed him to maintain his own standing in the settlement while performing a mild sympathy for her situation. She had expected, at minimum, a recalibration, and nothing. There was something in those two words that she could not fully dismantle. They were not reassurance. She would have known what to do with reassurance, which was to thank it politely and discard it because reassurance was cheap, and men had offered her cheap things before. They were not a declaration of any kind. They were simply a statement of continuation. "I have heard the thing. I am still here tomorrow." She did not know what to do with this. She sat at her table that evening and she allowed herself to think about it, which was unusual. She usually thought around things rather than at them. It was safer. Thinking directly at something meant acknowledging that it was there, and acknowledging that it was there and acknowledging that it was there meant having to decide what to do with it. He had heard the accusation, and he had come to the creek, and he had said nothing, and he would be there tomorrow. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at the empty chair. For the first time in 3 years, she looked at the empty chair directly instead of around it. He was there the next day. Not at the creek, at the property line, this time, with a post-hole digger and the look of a man with a morning's work organized in his mind. The eastern fence, she realized. He was extending his own fence line in a direction that would, incidentally, provide additional border for the eastern edge of her property, the side with the repaired break that the Alderton boy had made. She came outside with her coffee and watched him for a moment from the doorway. He looked up once, acknowledged her with a nod, and went back to work. She went back inside. She drank her coffee at the window. This was not romance. She was precise enough in her understanding of things to know what romance looked like, and this was not it. Romance is a performance. Romance requires an audience. Romance involves the construction of a version of oneself that is larger and more luminous than the actual version, a version designed to attract and to hold. Romance was something she had been part of once, and it had had the lifespan of a lit match. Bright, warm, and over before you realized it had consumed itself. This was not that. This was something that had no name she could locate immediately, something that was not about her at all, or not only about her, it was about him, about something in him that operated on a different mechanism than most people she had known. Most people did things because of the response they expected. Most people's kindness was transactional in the deepest sense. Not cruelly, not consciously, but fundamentally. They gave with one hand and waited with the other. He did not seem to be waiting. This was the thing she could not get her mind around. She kept reaching for the shape of what he wanted, the thing this was leading to, the eventual ask that would clarify the exchange and allow her to understand the terms. And she kept finding nothing. Not absence of feeling. She didn't think he was without feeling. But absence of demand. He simply kept doing what he was doing. He finished the post hole and moved to the next mark. She watched the steam rise from her cup. The situation with Alderton resolved itself in a way that was neither dramatic nor particularly satisfying, but was, in its quiet way, definitive. A week after the accusation, the missing grain was found. In the loft of the Alderton's own secondary storage, which the boy Petir had moved it to during a reorganization project he had undertaken without informing his father, as 13-year-old boys sometimes undertake projects without informing their fathers. This was established publicly, not through any great investigation, but through the ordinary process of facts eventually refusing to stay hidden. Alderton did not apologize. Men like Alderton rarely do. They find ways to reframe rather than retract, to present the evolution of the truth as a clarification rather than a correction. He said to Hal, within earshot of several people, that there had been a misunderstanding. He said this in a tone that distributed the misunderstanding evenly, as though it had been a shared production. Marin heard about it from Howell's wife, who told her with the slightly uncomfortable air of a person delivering information that requires them to acknowledge they were wrong about something. Dora said, "It seems there was a misunderstanding." Marin said, "It seems so." She went home. She stood at the window and looked at the snow and thought about what she felt, which turned out to be less than she would have predicted. Not satisfaction. Not vindication, exactly. Something quieter, something like the feeling of a door that has been stuck for a long time finally opening, not dramatically, not with any great release of accumulated pressure, but simply opening, becoming passable. She had not left, she had not planned to leave, not truly. The shape of departure she had been holding was more precaution than plan, a fire escape, noted unmapped, available if needed. But she had been aware in the days of waiting that the choice was real. She could have gone. She had gone before. She knew how. She had stayed, and she was not sure. Yet what to make of that? The thaw came in late February, early, as though the season were embarrassed by its own excess, and wanted to begin its apology. The snow retreated up the hillsides and held there, diminished, while the valley below exhaled and unfurled. The creek came back to itself with a rush and a tumbling insistence. The mud was extraordinary for approximately 2 weeks, and then settled into the soft, dark, receptive earth that is the reward for having survived the mud. She planted her seeds. She did this every year, and every year it was the same and different. The same act, the same small deliberate faith of pushing something living into the ground and asking the ground to keep it. And different because she was different each time, because 3 years of survival accumulate, as surely as the rings in a tree, adding density and direction. She was on her knees in the kitchen garden when she heard his boots on the path. Spring settled and deepened. There were mornings when she woke before first light and lay in the dark listening to the new birds, the ones that had come back with the warmth, and felt something she had no name for, something that was not happiness exactly, because happiness had always seemed to her too large and untrustworthy, a thing to claim, but was something adjacent to it, something in the same neighborhood, something that felt, tentatively and without guarantee, like the beginning of a different way of thinking about the morning. He brought the fennel seed. She planted it along the south edge of the kitchen garden, where the light was strongest. He stood nearby, not watching, looking elsewhere, giving her the privacy of the work, and eventually sat on the old fence rail that marked the property boundary and looked at the sky in the easy way of someone who can be idle without anxiety. She had been watching him learn the property the way you watch someone learn a language, gradually, without announcement. He knew now where the drainage ran bad in heavy rain. He knew which section of the tree line she favored for deadfall, and he had begun leaving that section clear. He knew that she used the eastern creek path in the morning and the ridge path in the afternoon, and his movements arranged themselves accordingly, neither avoiding her nor pursuing her, simply acknowledging the pattern without requiring it to be different. She had been noticing all of this. She sat back when the fennel was in and looked at the row. "My mother grew fennel," she said. It came out before she had decided to say it, which was unusual for her. She was normally deliberate. This was small, but it was not nothing. There were mornings now when she crossed paths with Dora in the store, and the silence between them had a different texture. Not warm, not yet, perhaps never fully warm, but no longer hostile. The flat non-acknowledgement had shifted, almost imperceptibly, towards something that was at least in the same building as acknowledgement. She did not make too much of this. She had learned long ago not to make too much of the small movements of social weather. But she noticed. She noticed other things, too. She noticed that Callum had, over the course of the spring and into the summer, acquired a reputation in the settlement that was the opposite of hers. People trusted him in the way they trust a man whose word and action are the same thing, who will not say he is going to do something and then not do it, who will not tell you something is safe when it isn't, who will tell you an uncomfortable truth in a tone so matter-of-fact that it goes down easier than a comfortable lie. Howell relied on him for the kind of judgment calls that settlements need and rarely have, what to do about the bridge at the valley's edge, whether a particularly disputed claim at the northern property line was what it appeared to be. He never spoke about her to these people. She knew because she listened. In the careful way she had always listened to everything, and his name and her name never occupied the same sentence in public. He had not made her his project. This was the thing she had been waiting to discover, and finding it was not there. Proclaimed the announcement, the performance of having rescued someone, left her off balance in a way she had not anticipated. She had been waiting for it. She had been watching for the moment when his constancy would turn into currency, when the account he had been building would be presented for payment. It did not come, and the absence of it was almost more difficult to absorb than its presence would have been. She tested it. She was not proud of this, but she was honest about it, which she valued more than pride. She tested it the way you test ice before trusting it with your weight, not to destroy it, but to know what it could hold. She was distant for a week. Not rudely, she was never rude without cause, but she withdrew the small daily proximity that had developed between them. She did not go to the creek at the time she usually went. She did not work the section of the garden nearest the property line. She took the ridge path in the morning and the east path in the afternoon. Reversing her usual pattern, she waited to see what he would do. He did nothing differently. He did nothing differently. He was at the Fenwick property doing what he always did. He was at the store when he needed to be. He was in the settlement present, unremarkable, unhurried. He did not seek her out. He did not appear at her door with the particular wounded look of someone who has noticed the withdrawal and needs to discuss it. He continued to exist. She found this. Infuriating was too strong a word. Disorienting. She had expected him to flinch. She had expected the withdrawal to produce some response that would clarify the terms, that would reveal what she had always known, that even the most patient constancy had a breaking point, that even the quietest presence was finally conditional, that you could test the ice as carefully as you liked, and it would eventually give way. It did not give way. On the 8th day, she went to the creek at her usual time. She came back along the east path. She was at the kitchen garden when she heard him at the property line fence. Doing something, she did not look immediately. She made herself wait a breath, and then she looked. He was checking the fence rail he had repaired in winter, testing it with both hands. It was fine. It had been fine all spring. She checked it herself, but he was checking it anyway, with the methodical care of someone to whom the quality of a thing matters independent of whether anyone is watching. He did not look up when she looked. He finished his check. He stood. He started back to his property. "Callum," she said. He stopped. He turned. She looked at him for a moment. "The fennel is coming up," she said. He looked at the garden. He nodded once, the way he nodded at things that were proceeding as they should. "Good stock," he said. He went home. She stood in the kitchen garden with the fennel at her feet, and she felt something give way inside her. Not a collapse, not a breaking. Something more like the releasing of a tension she had been holding so long she had forgotten was tension. A muscle releasing. The kind of ache that comes after, that is not unpleasant, that means something has finally been allowed to stop working so hard. She sat down right where she was, among the plants, in the dirt, in the late summer afternoon light, and she put her hands in the soil, and she stayed there until the light changed. Autumn arrived without drama. The leaves went gold, and the gold went brown, and the wind came off the mountains carrying the first suggestions of the cold to come. And she stood at her window in the evening with her tea and watched it arrive and felt, for the first time in a very long time, not the anticipated dread of another winter, but something more complicated and more tender than dread. The stores were good this year. The kitchen garden had produced beyond what she had planned for, and she had traded well and she had eaten well, and her wood supply was, she could admit this now. She had been admitting it slowly all summer, substantially better than she would have managed alone. Not because she had accepted charity, because she had incrementally and without ceremony allowed proximity to become something that was not partnership. A subtle shift, almost invisible from outside, enormous from inside. She thought about what she was going to do with the empty chair. She thought about this for several evenings, sitting at the table after the day was done, in the way she thought about things that required honesty, directly, without flinching, without looking for a version of the truth that was easier to hold. The chair was empty because she had decided a long time ago that the people who occupied chairs eventually left, and that it was better to live with the preemptive absence than with the presence and then the departure. Better to practice the vacancy. Better to know what you were going back to before you had to go back to it. She had been practicing the vacancy for a very long time. She looked at the chair. "I've never grown it," she said. "It grows easily," he said. "Once it starts, you can't stop it." She held the bundle and looked at it. The smell of it rose up from the wrapping, citrus and green and clean, the smell of something that intends to persist. They drank their coffee. They did not talk about the winter that was coming, or the winter that had passed, or what had happened in the space between those winters. They talked about the lemon balm, and where she might plant it in the spring. And he described the soil conditions it preferred with the kind of careful particularity of someone who has paid close attention to small things, and she listened in the way she had always listened, carefully, completely, without performance. And the morning light moved slowly across the table. Outside, the first leaves were falling. The creek could be heard steady and clear from where they sat. She looked at him across the table. This quiet, competent, this quiet, competent, unhurried man who had arrived in the early winter of a year ago with a horse and a pack mule and 2 crates of tools, and had proceeded, without announcement or requirement, to simply stay. And she thought about what it meant that he was still here. Not what it meant about him exactly, though it meant something about him, but what it meant about her, that she had stayed, that when the shape of departure had been available and familiar and well within reach, she had not taken it. That she was sitting here in her own cabin at her own table with her hands around her own cup, and someone across from her who had not left, and that for the first time in longer than she could clearly locate, she was not waiting for them, too. It was not a loud thought. It landed quietly the way the first snow lands, not a verdict, This time, not an arrival of something harsh, just a settling, a covering over of the old ground with something new and clean and temporary by nature, as all seasons are temporary, but real while it lasted, real in the way that only present things are real. She said, "It's a good morning."